I'm pleased to call on Alex de Waal, who is a leading thinker on Africa. He currently serves as a fellow of the Global Equity Initiative at Harvard University and as program director at the Social Science Research Council in New York City. He has been focusing on Sudan as far back as the mid-1980s, when he was writing about the famine there for his thesis at Oxford University. Most recently, he served on the African Union mediation team for Darfur. We look forward to your comments, Mr. de Waal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for this.
Can you pull the mic closer to you, please? And push the button.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the privilege of being able to address this committee. I submitted a written testimony, and I won't attempt to summarize that.
It will be entered in the record without objection.
I want to just make a few points. The first is that ought implies can. Our experience is that our leverage in Sudan is sadly limited. The capacity that we collectively, the international community, especially the United States, have for making the Sudan government act in certain ways is limited. Let me make a couple of comparisons of the situation today with 10 years ago, when some of the instances that my old friend and colleague John Prendergast was referring to occurred. 10 years ago, the Sudan government was regionally isolated. It did not have the support of Arab countries, especially because agents from Sudan had tried to assassinate the Egyptian president. It did not have the support of its neighbors, and the Ethiopian government actually had several tank divisions in Sudanese territory threatening and actually capturing towns. And that was pressure that really forced the Sudan government to change its ways. China was not on the scene in a significant way, and the national budget of the Sudan government in the late 1990s was in the region of $900 million per year. Today, Sudan is not regionally isolated. There is no neighbor that is going to put a tank division on Sudanese soil. China has become a major supporter. And the national budget of the Sudan government is $11.7 billion. So I would argue, to start off with, that the Sudan government feels a lot more confident today than it did 10 years ago. And consequently, our leverage is comparably diminished. I'd like to draw a couple of lessons from what was a very frustrating, painful, often disillusioning experience in the African Union mediation for the Darfur peace talks over the last couple of years, and especially on the security track. My particular role was facilitating the discussions on the security arrangements exactly this time last year. We concluded, in fact, a year ago today. The first is, I absolutely agree, and I think everybody agrees, that deployment of an effective peacekeeping force is essential. But let's not have inflated expectations about what that force can achieve. The 20,000 troops mandated by UN Security Council Resolution 1706 were derived directly from the implementation plan that the team drew up in Abuja, including UN and United States military officers as well as AU officers. What that force could do, according to that plan, according to the resources given to it, were to monitor a ceasefire, to monitor the ban on offensive military flights. And let me just make two small points. More than 1 year ago, we were given evidence that the Sudanese Air Force was painting helicopters and aircraft with AU insignia. This was an act of perfidy that was brought to the African Union by, amongst others, myself, and we confronted the Sudan government with this. And there is a paragraph in the Darfur peace agreement that specifically refers to this. I don't have it in front of me, but I can refer you to it, in which the Sudan government undertook specifically that it would not undertake such acts of perfidy again. In addition, the Darfur peace agreement provides for the ground monitoring of the ban on offensive military flights. It provides for monitors to be at airfields in order to ensure that no offensive military flight takes off. That has not been enforced, but it is there already in the peace agreement. I, among others, made sure that was written in and agreed to. So a force could do that, could actually monitor that. Enforcing it is a different question. It could monitor the measures to neutralize and disarm the Janjaweed. It could protect humanitarian supply routes, and it could monitor the disarmament, the demilitarization, I apologize, the demilitarization of IDP camps, with the agreement, consent, and cooperation of the parties. What such a force could not do, according to our military experts, including officers from the US and the UN, is it could not police Darfur, it could not disarm the Janjaweed, it could not protect the majority of civilians in the event of an eruption of violence. Now, we know the history of UN peacekeeping forces in that regard, and I think we must be realistic in that respect. A peace support operation is a support to a peace process, not a substitute for it. And what has been lacking in this discussion, I think, is the development of a real concept of operations for such a force. A mandate gives the limits on what it is entitled to do legally. The numbers and the armaments give it the capacity, but the concept of operations and the leadership provide it with the plan for how it will operate during the estimated 5 to 7 years. Let me repeat, 5 to 7 years for which such a force is likely to be needed. My second point is on the peace process. I absolutely agree with John Prendergast that unity among the rebels is desirable. I worked very hard to try and achieve that. Let me report that, honestly, I don't think it is going to be achieved in the coming months, possibly not in the coming years. The rebels will remain disunited. Their leadership has been, frankly, disastrous. The government has very little reason, very little incentive to negotiate with them. Chad and Eritrea are meddling, and the mediation as it exists now has very little clout, very little credibility. But one thing we could do, we could contemplate, is what actually was done a year ago in Abuja. The parties in Abuja were not seriously negotiating. Neither side was adjusting its position. And in response to that, the African Union, partly at the prompting of the US and the UN, put a paper on the table. There are many problems with that paper, which we could go into, but it was a paper for discussion which ultimately became the text of the Darfur Peace Agreement. A year on, we can see many flaws, many valid criticisms of that. Is not the time arising when we should actually return to the substance and actually put specific proposals, political proposals, on the table, which we can be confident would be accepted by the rebels, and actually shortcut this, what is likely to be a very painful, drawn-out process of trying to corral these people together? Herding cats does not do justice to the difficulty of organizing such talks. And lastly, I'd like to emphasize a Darfur peace agreement only makes sense if there is a comprehensive peace agreement that is working, that has the confidence of the Sudanese people. If the Darfurians see the CPA as a ceiling on their ambition, or worse still, as a sinking ship, they have absolutely no reason to join it. And I think given the limited leverage, the need for good, accurate analysis and prioritization, I would argue very strongly that we must make the faithful implementation of the CPA, especially its measures for democratization, an absolute priority. I thank you very much for allowing me to.
Thank you very much, Dr. de Waal, and I want to thank again this extraordinarily informative and courageous and significant panel.
I think there's a great deal that can be done internally. We have a tendency to focus on the external pressures and action points. One of the things that has been sadly lacking, particularly in the last nearly 12 months since the Darfur Peace Agreement was signed and very, very inadequately implemented, in fact, hardly implemented at all, has been real engagement internally with standing up some of the key provisions which if implemented, could make a huge difference. The Darfur Peace Agreement includes provisions for a security advisory team from a foreign country. I presume it wouldn't be the United States, but it could be, for example, Canada or the Netherlands or a country like that, that has a great deal of authority over a whole raft of key security implementation issues within Darfur. It provides for very robust monitoring mechanisms. Through the Ceasefire Commission, there's been no assistance, there's been no effective US engagement internally with the making the Ceasefire Commission work, setting up a group that was agreed, which was a working group on disarming the Janjaweed. All these sorts of issues internally within Sudan could make a practical difference and should be done anyway. They will have to happen at some point, whether or not there is any external pressure. So I would put that as a first issue. The second is that I think we need to be clear about what is the long-term outcome. If President Bashir fears that he will share the same fate as Saddam Hussein, no amount of pressure is going to force him, compel him to change his policy. There may be a regime change. You may decide to invade Sudan and change the government. But short of that, pressure only works if there is an outcome that is ultimately acceptable to the person whom you are putting pressure on. He may be compelled to do a lot of things he doesn't want to do. But I think in fact, I'm confident that one of the reasons why the North-South peace agreement, the Naivasha process, came to a successful conclusion was that there was an end point, there was a finishing line, which was at the end of this period a Sudan that the US government said it would support, it would recognize. And I think we need to recognize that we need also a long-term overall political strategy for Sudan. And that is essentially enshrined within the CPA. It may need to be revised or revisited, but I think that needs to be put on the table in order for any pressure to have any measurable result. I have one small point to add to that, which is when we look at the tragedy of Darfur, we mustn't overlook some of the successes. And one of the successes is that the humanitarian operation in Darfur, despite its constraints, has achieved two extraordinary successes. One is for the majority of the population that have been reached and the general population that has been measured, the mortality and nutrition rates are normal and have been at normal levels for more than a year now, in some places for longer. And that is extraordinary. And I think that's a huge credit to the humanitarians and should be, and that effort should be supported and indeed extended into Chad and CAR. The second point is that most humanitarian operations on this scale end up being co-opted, becoming part of a war effort. That hasn't happened. There's been banditry, etc. But this operation has actually stayed out. It stayed very neutral. And that's also very, very impressive. And I think continuing to support that and recognizing that it is in important respects succeeding. Of course, this is not a solution. You know, no one would call this a solution, but keeping people alive is quite creditable. May I also take the liberty of just responding briefly to Mr. Smith? I think one of the shameful omissions of the last 2 years has been the failure to support AMIS. AMIS has been crying out for assistance, crying out for a mandate for funds, etc. And it's been allowed to stagnate, and that's really quite shocking. And even in the context of this hybrid force, AMIS is going to be there. So let's not forget that we need to boost that. I think we also need to recognize that this thing is going to be, that the force is going to be there for a long time, and that whatever are the rules of engagement, the majority of the time that force is not going to be using force. And the majority of the armed groups in Darfur are actually not part of this conflict. Most of them are tribal self-defense groups that are neutral, and they should be our friends. These are people we can work with. And so probably up to 90% of the work of an intervention force is actually community liaison, political liaison. Only 10% is force or use of force. And we mustn't forget that, because if we do forget that, then we will lead ourselves into a bunker mentality where when troops are there on the ground, they don't recognize their friends and their allies among the Darfurians. And the last point is, to be quite frank, I fail to see how military action to destroy the Sudanese Air Force and to put non-consensual deployment of troops on the ground would be interpreted by Khartoum as anything other than an act of war. I mean, we may be doing it for humanitarian reasons, but I don't think it would be, I confidently assert it would not be interpreted as such by Khartoum. And I think to take that type of action could have literally incalculable consequences. It could lead, for example, to the shutting down of the aid operation. It could lead to becoming embroiled in a very, very nasty conflict in Darfur. And I would strongly counsel against that kind of military action. Thank you. The question of a no-fly zone is ultimately one of enforcement. There's the monitoring aspect. Now, what is peculiarly unfortunate, to say the least, is there hasn't actually been any monitoring of the existing commitments that the Sudan government has undertaken, including in the Darfur Peace Agreement. And they're in black and white about no hostile military flights, no perfidy, no painting of military aircraft in UN or AU colors. That has simply not been monitored. No one has actually gone and reported publicly and said, this is what is happening. And so the very first recourse has never been taken. And I think it's true that, you know, if you catalogue all the threats that have been made against the government, they're huge and none of them has been followed through. What I think is called for is to be much more systematic and to ramp up the mechanism, starting with simply reporting, starting with saying, this is what you signed, this is what our people observed, these are the photographs, in this case going back to more than a year. We will take this to the UN Security Council and we will, you know, expose perfidy and violation. Take it one stage at a time. And one can move fairly rapidly up those stages. But because there hasn't even been that first stage of monitoring, we simply don't know how the Sudan government will respond. Now we can predict and that, you know, they'll start by responding with contempt. But I think for reasons of international politics, it's worth going through those stages, even perhaps going through them really quite quickly. And it's worth recalling how the no-fly zone or the bombing was halted in South Sudan by Senator Danforth when there was an incident in, I think, February 2002. Bieh was the name of the place, B-I-E-H. And the first response of the government was, oh, this is rogue, this is a rogue attack. Well, actually, every military activity needs to be authorized by General Headquarters. And so Senator Danforth said, well, don't tell me, show me. And very quickly, it actually had the desired impact. And again, this comes back to the question of speaking with authority and backing up statements. Briefly, one thing that I would implore as a short-term measure is to actually map the different groups in Darfur, because things change. The situation on the ground today is very different to a year ago. For example, throughout this conflict, the majority of the Arab tribes have been neutral. They have not actually been involved in the war. As we speak, some of them are talking with the rebels. Some of them, even some of the Janjaweed, are making local deals with the rebels. It would be very unfortunate if the consequence of US policy were to drive the Arabs and the government back together into the same camp. There are fissures there. There are real differences between them. The army, for example, the professional army officers are very nervous about the Janjaweed. They are outnumbered by them, outarmed by them, and embarrassed by them as well. And there are a lot of complexities there that I think need to be fully taken into account in terms of any either political or military activities. And at the moment, what I see lacking, one of the main things I see lacking in US engagement is the internal track, is actually ramping up the engagement with the groups inside Darfur, with the institutions like the Transitional Darfur Regional Authority, which frankly doesn't really
Right.
exist.
But precisely because of the multiple factions, how do we in fact deal with each of them separately? I mean, it seems very difficult.
This is why I emphasize that the primary role for any peacekeeping or peace support operation has to be a political or an intelligence or a community outreach. You have to regard the communities of Darfur, all of which are armed, everyone is armed, as your friends, your allies, your asset, your force multiplier. If a force of 5, 10, 15, 20, 50,000 goes in thinking we as a force can control the region, it's an illusion, it can't be done. If, on the other hand, a force goes in thinking we are going to work with the tribal chiefs, with the militia commanders, we're going to take these people and say, if you behave responsibly, we will work with you. And we will isolate the elements that are violent, out of control, engaged in ethnic cleansing, engaged in atrocities. Then you have the majority of Darfurians on your side, and you have a very different scenario.
It seems to me that's going to be a key in terms of implementing any lasting peace.
That's correct. Yeah.
Time has expired. We will now hear from Mr. Bozeman.